Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about conflict. If you're interested about the slides for this presentation, they are available at that bit.ly, and you'll see that again at the end. So, hi, my name's Art or Arthur, take your pick, and I'm a software engineer. But I love brains, not like in a weird zombie way, but I love brains, I love learning about them, I love figuring out how they work, and I love taking what psychology and psychiatry have taught us about how the brain works and applying that and using it to help us work better together, to build better things, to build amazing things. I build amazing things here. It's a small software consultancy in Omaha, Nebraska in the United States. Don't worry if you don't know where that is. It's small. But they let me come and do amazing things like talk at great conferences like this, so I'm grateful to them. So, first up, let's start with a quiz. It's everybody's favorite pastime, right? I want you to raise your hand if you've ever had a conflict with a coworker. I'm seeing hands not go up, and I don't believe you. Leave your hand up now if you enjoyed it. I knew there'd be a couple weirdos. But mostly, we don't like conflict. And that's because most conflict sucks, and we're bad at it. And as a result, we're usually pretty afraid of it. In fact, we do this whole thing called defensive avoidance, where we downplay, sidestep, and avoid conflict at almost every opportunity, and wherever we can, which is problematic because we build software. And conflict is everywhere. And a lot of developers love to argue, even though they hate conflict. So we'd better be prepared for it, because conflict can be beneficial as well. Now, luckily for us, psychology has done a bunch of research into how humans interact with each other and how we engage in conflict. So today, I'm going to take a bunch of that and I'm going to bring it to you. We're going to talk about the difference between task conflict, process conflict, and relationship conflict. And then we're going to talk about psychological safety as a groundwork for good conflict. And then we're going to talk about dealing with emotions during conflict. Please don't leave. I promise it will be good. We're also going to talk about confrontational styles that you have when you approach a conflict. And lastly, we're going to talk about how to deal with conflict if you're just an individual contributor. If you're not running a team, if you don't have a C in front of your job title, what can you do? We're going to walk away with some tips today for what you can actually do and how you can manage conflict. But for starters, it can be really useful to think of conflict in terms of where it originates. Conflict can come from discussions and disagreements we have about how to perform the task at hand. This is called task conflict. And task conflict is about what language do we use? What libraries are we using? What linter or auto formatter are we using? What standardized IDE do we pick as a team, or do we even care? How do we do these things? This is task conflict. And task conflict is good conflict. You might think that talking about these things and working through these things, and yes, even figuring out whether or not you're going to use tabs versus spaces in your code isn't worth the time. But it is. Figuring those things out can actually be part of a whole process where you're talking through the entirety of how you're building this. And that means it can help you find new ideas. It can help you solve problems in new and exciting ways. It can help you bring value to your customers, to your clients, to the people using your software in ways you would have never imagined. And it can help you locate risks and propose solutions, finding ways that it's not going to work, edge cases, scenarios that the solution won't cover. You can also think about conflict as originating from disagreements about how we do the things, the big process that's structured around how we work. Who's in charge of your team? What are the goals of your team? What are the outcomes you're looking for? How do you make decisions as a team? This is process conflict. And process conflict is also good. This can help us to find new ways of working together. It can help solidify our goals as a team. It can help solidify the outcomes, the things we want to see happen at the end of this process. It can also help us figure out if we have the right people in the team. Do we have the skill sets that we need to actually accomplish the tasks that have been put before us? But after a certain point, process conflict can start to become toxic. After you've gotten started, process conflict starts to slow you down. It can be disruptive to your team and can easily turn into pretty bad conflict. So you want to have most of these arguments and discussions about process up front. And if you don't have them up front, you can be sure you're going to have them later. They will come up, and dealing with them up front is way better for your team because it will help you realize and assemble norms for your team and decide how you want to move forward and help you gel and cohere as a team. Process conflict isn't just about individuals either, or in the side of your team. Process conflict can be about roles. If you have embedded QA on your teams, who decides when a ticket moves on? Is it the QA? Is it the dev? That's a process conflict that you'll have to figure out how that works. Lastly, conflict can come from interpersonal disagreements caused by personal distaste, dislike, power-seeking behaviors. This is the conflict that we hate. This is the conflict we're afraid of, that we seek to avoid at all costs. It's dark, and it's squamous, and it's dangerous. This can rip a team apart. This conflict doesn't help us do anything. It starts bad, and it gets worse. And we want to squash it wherever we find it. Conflict doesn't just arise inside of teams either. Conflict can happen in between teams, as I'm sure anybody that's worked at a job has figured out. Process conflict in particular can arise between teams. Are the allocations of resources fair? Are the priorities of these teams aligned? If you have a priority and this other team has a completely different priority, such that they never get around to the things you need from them, that interaction isn't going to work well for you in terms of your achieving success. And so that's process conflict you can bring up. Okay, so how do we maximize good conflict and minimize bad conflict? How do we stop that relationship conflict from happening? Well, like any good magic trick, most of the work of promoting good conflict happens well before the conflict even starts. So let's talk about psychological safety. I don't think it's a stretch for most of the people in the audience to say that humans are social animals, right? You've probably heard this before, that we interact with each other. And as a result of interacting with each other, we have relationships. And we kind of keep track internally of how strong those relationships are, whether they're positive or negative, right? We want a strong relationship with our spouse. We might have a bad relationship with the QA lead. We have a very weak relationship with that one weird rando on Twitter we followed one time. We keep track of these things internally, subconsciously. And we've also evolved to think of these relationships as just as important as our physical safety. And that makes sense if you think about it from an evolutionary psychology standpoint. If you're living in a small community of human beings in an environment where you have to work extremely hard to survive, being ostracized from that group can mean certain death. And your brain, helpfully, in the modern age, assumes that if somebody unfriends you on Twitter, that is certain death. It's not very helpful. But it is helpful for you to recognize that that is the response that's going to go on inside of your head. And that's happening because we are maintaining these relationships. Part of the reason that we're risk averse to conflict is that we are subconsciously trying to manage these relationship strengths. We're trying to preserve the relationships that are important to us, whether those are personal or whether those are happening at a business level. Improperly managed conflict can be damaging to these relationships. And so we turn around and we just don't say anything. Psychological safety is a description of a climate where people feel safe enough to take interpersonal risks by speaking up and sharing concerns, questions, or risks. The researcher Amy Edmondson has done a ton of work into psychological safety, and she describes it as a climate very intentionally. It is like an environment, like a biome. This is a thing that you exist in, not something that happens to you. Psychological safety isn't just about being nice either. It's not about that type of defensive avoidance where you downplay the conflict and don't bring something up because, oh, that might upset somebody. Because toxic positivity can be just as damaging to your workplace as toxic aggression. Not bringing up that you have a problem with someone, not bringing up that someone has a problem with their work can be damaging to them in the long run. Kim Scott wrote a whole book on this called Radical Candor. And psychological safety isn't just a personality factor either. It isn't something you bring with you from job to job. It's not something that is intrinsic to you. It is intrinsic to the environment in which you are, to that climate. And it's not just trust either. Although trust is an important part of psychological safety, I like to think about it as you give trust to a group and you receive psychological safety in return in an ideal situation. Okay, so why do you want it? Well, psychological safety is important for avoiding catastrophic failures. Without psychological safety, people hold back. Even when they believe what they have to say is important for the organization, for your customers and clients, for yourselves. You squash that response. You say, it's probably best not to say anything, because you're trying to unconsciously manage those relationships. And if bringing something up might be long-term beneficial, but in the short term, you're going to have a conflict with someone about it, your brain is going to tell you, just let that, just put that in the box, and we're never going to talk about it again. Because that's easy. Teams with psychological safety prevent catastrophic failures. If you work in an industry, because software is everywhere, if you work in an industry where you have high risks, like medical software, airlines, hardware for military things, whatever your job happens to be, if you work in an industry where there's significant risk of failure or significant consequences when failure happens, psychological safety can help you avoid those things, can help you avoid the catastrophic postmortems where you're sitting there going, why did this happen? And nobody wants to tell you that they all knew it was going to happen. Teams with psychological safety have higher performance, and they have higher engagement. If you have psychological safety in your job, you perform better, and you enjoy your job more. And most importantly, psychological safety can help you discover hidden conflict and surface it. What I mean by hidden conflict is you have conflicts in your team already, assuming that you work with other human beings. Because humans have conflicts with each other. That's part of what we do. And those conflicts are there, whether you're acknowledging them or not. Psychological safety can help you recognize those things, bring them up, and discuss them. Get through them, process them, because they're important. This conflict is already driving your team's interactions. And pretending it's not there isn't going to help you. And so psychological safety can help you move through that. It's all right. Sounds great. How do we get that? Well, I have some bad news. Psychological safety can't really be achieved at an organizational level. You cannot, if you are a CTO or an engineering principal lead at your company, you can't go into work on Monday and go, great, we're going to be psychologically safe now. Bam. It doesn't work that way. Psychological safety is about interpersonal relationships. And so it has to be established at the interpersonal level. This is why Edmondson describes it as a climate. It's like a microclimate. Individual teams can be psychologically safe, even while the larger organization is not. and it must be established at those levels. So from an organizational standpoint, all you can do is prepare the ground, much like gardening, and prepare that environment so that eventually it will emerge. But like gardening and like magic, you have to do that work up front, long before it's actually needed. Edmondson wrote a book. I really recommend it. I did a lot of research for this talk, called The Fearless Organization. In it, she describes the leader's toolkit for building psychological safety. It looks like this. Has kind of 3 phases: set the stage, invite participation, and then respond productively. In setting the stage, you frame the work and you emphasize purpose. In inviting participation, you demonstrate situational humility and you practice inquiry. And then responding productively, you express appreciation, you destigmatize failure, and you sanction clear violations. We're going to walk through each of these in turn. So let's start with setting the stage. The very first thing you need to start doing. And the first step of setting the stage is framing the work. You need to reframe failure. And you need to reframe failure as learning. And you need to reframe failure as learning publicly and visibly. You need to discuss these failures and what you've learned from them. Because that's going to help people recognize that failure is not the end of the road. Edmondson breaks it down into 3 kind of archetypes of failure, ways that she discusses failure. The first of these is preventable failure, or process deviation. Preventable failure happens in situations like manufacturing, like fast food delivery, like basic utilities and services. It is deviations from known processes that produce unwanted outcomes. So if you think about software delivery or software implementation, where you're taking an existing implementation of software and shipping it out to a client or installing it, that's an example of this. You know what to do. You can rinse and repeat this. And there is a best practice that you should be following. In this case, you want to catch failure and correct it. You want to correct deviations from that norm, from those best practices. And you want to celebrate that failure by telling people who bring it up, good catch. Congratulations, you prevented us from failing. And you want to appreciate those who notice tiny mistakes. Common causes of preventable failure can be behavior, skill problems, or even attention deficiencies. And I don't mean that from a personal level, but if somebody's overwhelmed with a bunch of different tasks and they don't have enough attention to pay to this particular task, that can be a reason for this sort of failure too. Something can slip through the cracks. The second archetype of failure is complex failure, or system breakdown. This is happening in contexts like hospital care, like the US NASA shuttle program, like aircraft carriers, like nuclear reactors. The definition here is unique and novel combinations of events and actions that give rise to unwanted outcomes. And I would actually argue most software engineering fits into this category. Because we're doing things that we know how to do, largely, but we're doing them in new and interesting situations each time. You know how to write code, but you might not know how to do it for this particular company, or this particular framework, or this particular environment, or this particular vertical. And each of those things is novel and risky. Common causes of this can be complexity, variability, novel factors imposed on familiar situations. In this kind of scenario, you want to celebrate failure by recognizing when you've learned something or when you've identified a risk and say, you've done it. You've found something. You've helped us, explore the unknowns of this area. You also want to turn around and celebrate people who've caught failure early. This can be really difficult because your brain looks and sees, well, they did a small thing and then a small thing didn't happen. But in complex failure situations, failures cascade because you can't map the entirety of a complex situation. Any reasonable sized software situation, you have things that will cascade into each other as failures. And as a result, when something fails at a small level, it will, cascade outward. And your brain is not good at looking and saying, well, that small thing could have become this and could have become that. And you need to actually take time to go, well, what would that have happened? What would have occurred? And celebrate and say, you stopped $1 million from going down the drain by making a 2-line code change. Good job. The last kind of failure archetype is intelligent failure. And Edmondson describes this as novel forays into new territory that lead to unwanted outcomes. In this, she's talking about contexts like drug development or new product design. If you're out there in a startup, if you're out there trying to innovate, if you're trying to develop the next new widget or the next new UI or UX innovation, the way that people work with things, even the next new hardware device that people are working with, this is where you're living, in intelligent failure. Common causes of intelligent failure can be uncertainty, experimentation, and risk-taking. And in this case, you want to celebrate, because being creative and being innovative is going to involve a lot of failure. And in fact, you will only achieve success through dramatic failure. You have to fail real hard in order to eventually find success if you're actually trying to be innovative. You also need to reframe the boss. Typically, in the traditional environment, a boss is someone who has all the answers. You go to them and you're like, what should I do? And they say, you should do this. And then you go do the thing. In a psychologically safe context, however, a boss is the person who sets the direction. In a traditional environment, the boss is the one that gives the orders. And you need to reframe that to be the boss is the person who invites input to clarify and improve that direction for the entire company, for the entire team, whatever the scope is. Lastly, in a traditional context, the boss assesses others' performance. And you need to flip that around to be the boss is the person who creates condition for continued learning. If you want to be innovative, if you want to find those complex failures when they're small, you need to turn it around and frame that failure as learning. You've probably heard the adage of, I think it was IBM, who had an intern take down like a database, something production, and caused like $3 million on a mainframe of damage. And I believe it was a news reporter asked the IBM CEO, okay, so is that intern fired? And he's like, hell no, we just paid $3 million to educate this kid. That story could be apocryphal, but it's a perfect example of what I mean. Failure is learning. Bosses traditionally view others as subordinates. You need to do what they're told. This is kind of the traditional model of a boss. And if you want to be someone who is promoting psychological safety, you need to flip it around. You need to say that other people are contributors who have crucial knowledge and insight. The people who know the most about a problem are the people who are working on that problem, not the people managing those people. You also need to emphasize a sense of purpose. Together, you are working to do a thing. You are working to find innovative things. You are working to navigate complex scenarios. Because tasks can differ in other ways, too. Uncertainty can happen. It can be different there. How alert do you need to be to failures? If you're in an innovative situation, you're taking risks and you're exploring, failure is a given. Failure is a must. If you're in the situation where you have a strict set of things and you need to not deviate from them because you are building medical software, failure is pretty bad because you might accidentally give someone 3 times the dose of radiation and kill them. So knowing what uncertainties exist for the tasks that we're working, what is the interdependence? Who depends on the stuff that we're writing? And how does what we're writing affect them? And what's at stake? What are the costs of failure? The next stage is inviting participation. Starting to open the doors for people to come to you. And the first step in that is demonstrating situational humility. Because nobody wants to participate in crap and you pretend you have all the answers. That's not fun. You need to adopt a learning and a humble mindset. Situational humility. Edmondson describes situational humility as the need for humility lies in the situation. I do not know all the answers, so I must be humble. This includes acknowledging your errors and shortcomings as a leader. You want to err on the side of I don't know when somebody asks you a question. And I know that's real hard for us engineers, because we want to have an opinion. And you need to set aside that gut response to have an opinion about something and just say, I'm not sure. You also need to be aware of power, because power can cause leaders to become obsessed with control and with outcomes rather than with people and with process. You also need to practice inquiry. There's this thing in psychology called naive realism. And naive realism is this thing that we all do where we believe that how we see the world is how the world is. And I have news for you. How you see the world is not how the world is, because everything that you experience is mediated by the wet sack of meat that's between your ears. Every sense you have is going through that thing. That doesn't mean that reality doesn't exist in a weird matrix sense. I mean, it could. But my point is, your way of viewing the world and the things that you think are true and guaranteed aren't necessarily that. And you need to be humble. If you think you know what's going on all the time, you start failing to be curious. And failing to be curious leads you to miss things. Additionally, depending on your company's culture, asking questions could be seen as weak. Especially if you feel like you're expected to be a leader. Especially if you are a new leader and people are looking to you for directions. A question can help broaden understanding of a situation. What else is going on? What else could we be doing? What other things are occurring? Or it can help deepen understanding. Well, why do you think so? Why do you think that's true? What's causing that? Edmondson actually provides some rules for a good question. The first is, start with you don't know the answer. It's not very fun if somebody asks you a question and the answer they want is embedded in the question, because they pretty clearly don't want your actual input at that point. So you need to not do that. You also need to ask questions that don't limit responses to yes or no. Ask open-ended questions. And you need to phrase that question in a way that helps focus other people's thinking. Okay, so we're looking at this particular scenario and this particular choice. What do you think are the options here? Are there anything we're missing? Those kind of open-ended questions, those kind of thoughtful questions, instantly indicate to everyone in the room that their voice is actually desired. You also want to demonstrate what Edmondson calls leadership inclusiveness. And this can make the difference in high-stakes environments. If you're working in something like nuclear reactors, or aircraft carriers, or hospitals. Leadership inclusiveness says that leaders are approachable and accessible, that you can actually get a meeting with this person, that you don't put off this air of, I'm too busy. You also want to acknowledge fallibility. Acknowledge not only when you've made a mistake, but that you could make mistakes in the future. Leadership, or leaders who do leadership inclusiveness, also proactively invite input from others. And one of the ways you can do that is by starting to set up structures and processes at your company. Implement specific structures to start soliciting input. Safety councils, if you work at someplace like manufacturing or in that healthcare context. Cross-functional discussion groups between, say, QA and UX and developers. Or learning communities, doing book clubs even, something as simple as that, where you're encouraging everyone to both be a learner and a teacher. That can also help tell people that they are expected to contribute their perspectives, and that those perspectives are wanted. Lastly, there's responding productively. And the first step in responding productively is to express appreciation. This seems simple and easy, and to an extent it is. When somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I'm worried about this, or what about this, or this thing could be a problem. Or, hey, I'm encountering this thing with this, and I'm not sure it's going to work for this particular scenario. In that moment, you want to appreciate that they took a risk. Remember, their brains are screaming at them to not do this thing. Because their brain says, you want to manage the relationship, you want to just shove that in a box and not worry about it. They took a risk to bring this up to you. And you want to appreciate that risk and the effort that it took for them to make it. Because that takes courage. And then you want to turn around and educate them. If you have information, for instance, that they don't, you only provide that after you've appreciated them. So for instance, if they have, you have a piece of information they don't, you could say, oh, thank you very much for bringing that up. I appreciate that took a lot of energy and risk. There's also this thing happening over here. Does that change your opinion any? Or are you still concerned? That's a way of taking their concern and trying to go, oh, here's a piece of the picture puzzle that you didn't see. Is there still a problem, or do we need to have a further discussion? Now, also super important, appreciation has to be genuine. If you come at the person and you're like, thanks very much for your input, we're moving on to the next thing in the agenda, nobody buys that. And you have to be genuine with it, all right? You also want to destigmatize failure. You started working to reframe it up front, but now you need to turn around and destigmatize it. The relationship between failure and creativity has to be made explicit. In the traditional concept, or traditional framing, the concept of failure is that failure is not acceptable. We must succeed. You have to turn around and reframe that into that failure is a natural byproduct of experimentation. And that it's going to happen, and it teaches us something. In the traditional framing, effective performance is viewed as effective performers don't fail. Instead, you need to turn around and say effective performers produce, learn from, and share lessons from their intelligent failures. These people are going out there intending, to some extent, to fail because it's going to teach them something. In a traditional context, the goal is to prevent failure. But instead, the goal needs to be to promote fast learning. The traditional framing has an output that is catastrophic to your organization, because if you do all of the things in the traditional framing column, what's going to happen is people are going to hide their failures from you. And you're only going to find out about it when it's way too late to do anything. Because they're afraid to bring it up. They're going to push it under the rug and hope that it goes away. Oops, sorry about that. Instead, you need to have open discussion, fast learning, and innovation. That needs to be the way that you're approaching this framing. Lastly, you need to sanction clear violations. And this seems like it might be a little weird because you're already discussing, we've been discussing, like you need to be open and appreciate the people bringing things up and reframing failure in all of these ways. But if leaders always respond to failure the same way, that actually doesn't create a healthy environment for learning. What you want to do is look for failures that are happening because somebody was sloppy, because somebody broke a rule or broke a norm. That's very different than if somebody is making a thoughtful hypothesis and exploring the outcomes of that. If you turn around and say, you did something that was dangerous, that was harmful, that was sloppy, and you sanction that person, whatever the rules of your organization are, everyone else's psychological safety will actually be enforced, or reinforced, excuse me. They'll turn around and feel more safe because they know that there isn't just a free-for-all. You want to reinforce your corporate values in those regards, your personal values, and you want to turn around and not suggest that there's just one strike and it's out. The question becomes, can you get psychological safety if the hierarchy above you is garbage? If they're raining frogs on you all day, for starters, I would love to come and see where you work. But beyond that, can you get psychological safety? And the answer is yes. You can build a psychologically safe team that considers when information crosses that boundary. But inside of your team, you're psychologically safe. You're bringing up things, you're considering things and discussing things. That's entirely possible. And importantly, this can be a way to push psychological safety outward. If you get a psychologically safe team that is engaged and performing well and delivering, other people are going to look at that and go, wait, what's happening here? And you can be like, psychological safety. And hopefully everyone else will learn from that. But psychological safety isn't enough here. We are human, and humans have emotions. So our emotions often get in the way. So let's talk about dealing with our emotions. It is tempting to think that shoving our emotions into a bag, suppressing them, and reducing and controlling them is going to lead to better, more constructive conflict. It's all better if we're rational, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. For starters, shoving your emotions away into a bag doesn't make them go away. Therapy would be a hell of a lot easier if this was all it took. In addition, the majority of developers are men still. And men, culturally in the West, are still not taught how to deal well with our emotions. And so what happens is we'll shove them down and repress them and then turn them into anger, which is not great in a workplace context. To start dealing with emotions, I want to start with this book, which I love this book. I do not recommend you read it. It is like 300 pages of the densest psychology stuff I have ever read. It is written by Argus and Schoen in 1974, and it's wonderful. And they talk about this difference between what they call Model 1 and Model 2. These are models for interactions with other humans. Model 1 seeks to win in zero-sum environments. They want to set up a situation where they win and the other person loses. They seek to control the emotions of the other participants in the group. And they seek to enact concrete strategies to achieve those outcomes. Model 1 can lead to two different things. You've probably heard of self-fulfilling prophecies before, but it can also lead to what Argus and Schoen call self-sealing processes. Now, to walk us through both of these, because the difference between them is a little weird, we're going to do two examples. So let's talk about self-fulfilling prophecies first. And to help us do that, we're going to look at Sawyer and Morgan. Sawyer is a student in Morgan's class. And Morgan has been told that Sawyer is a troublemaker, quote unquote. So they keep a pretty sharp eye out for Sawyer stepping out of line, more so than they do with the other students. And Sawyer starts feeling like they're being singled out unfairly, because they are. And as a result, they get angry at Morgan. At that point, Sawyer's going to turn around and start acting out in an attempt to display their lack of respect. That's going to just reinforce Morgan's opinion. These two are now inside of what's called a vicious circle, where the behavior leads to more belief, the belief leads to more behavior, the more behavior leads to more belief, and it's a downward spiral. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the other hand, we have self-sealing processes. And to walk through that, we're going to talk about Jordan and Taylor. Jordan is Taylor's manager. And Jordan doesn't think Taylor's very good at coding. But they also believe that they can't confront Taylor about that, because Taylor's going to get upset about it. And they don't want to deal with that conflict. They need to win by minimizing Taylor's emotions, by controlling the situation, because they're engaging in Model 1. So what's going to happen is Jordan's going to turn around and not have the conversation. And instead, they're just going to assign Taylor a bunch of QA tasks and then go, wow, you did so great at that. You're really good at QA. Keep it up. Taylor isn't an idiot. And they have doubts about the authenticity of Jordan's feedback, as they should. But they don't confront Jordan about it because Jordan's their boss. And that's going to lead to a confrontation that could potentially end in them not having their job. So what they're going to do is just be angry about this deception. And they're going to stonewall Jordan. They're going to refuse to transition. Jordan, the manager, is now trapped in a prison of their own making. As long as they believe they have to prevent Taylor getting upset, all they can do is keep doing the same thing that has already not worked. This is a self-sealing process. It locks you into this prison where you have to keep doing the same thing over and over, even though you know that it's not going to be effective. The alternative to these behaviors is Model 2. Model 2 seeks to arrive at a win-win scenario, to find something that works for both groups. It seeks to accept and understand the emotions of the person on the other side of that scenario. And it seeks at all costs to avoid self-sealing processes, to maximize the ability to continue and try different theories of action, as Argus and Schoen put it. In the Model 2 scenario, Jordan just sits down and has the conversation with Taylor about, look, I'm not sure that you're cut out for dev. This is the behavior I'm seeing. These are the data points that I have. And Taylor can explain, I'm not sure I'm fit for this team because this is really boring to me and I'd really love to be going to do something like DevOps. You can find win-win scenarios if you take the time to explore. But if you're anxious, if you're afraid of conflict and afraid of emotions and afraid of losing, you will naturally gravitate toward Model 1. Trying to control that other person, to puppet master them. And I have news for you. You're a bad puppet master. So am I. So is every other human. We can't predict or control other humans that well. If you try to control other people's emotions, you are setting up a self-fulfilling prophecy. People will wind up more emotional as you attempt to control them. Okay, so that's a big mess. What the hell do we do about that? Well, we try to provide psychological safety and we prepare to get uncomfortable. That's what. Because it's not going to be comfortable and it's not going to be easy, but it's absolutely worth doing. We want to drag emotions out into the open by doing a couple different things. And the first of those is we want to offer explicit points to talk about emotions. If you follow Scrum, you have retrospectives. This is a perfect opportunity to talk about your emotions. How do you feel about the work we did this sprint? Are you proud of it? That phrasing sounded a little aggressive. Don't maybe do that. But asking somebody, are you proud of the work you did? Do you think we could have done better? That's a way to prompt and to drag emotions out of people. In postmortems, you can ask questions like, after that outage, how did you feel? How did you feel about the circumstances before or the circumstances after? As a leader in your team, whether you have a title or not, you can model emotional talk. You can say things like, well, I don't understand how this system works, and that scares me. It scares me because it makes me afraid we're going to be held liable for something we don't have any control over. I've modeled some of these things with my own team. I've held a postmortem where we had the team lead was taking on and doing something every morning that nobody else knew he was doing, nobody else on the team. And he screwed it up one day because he made a mistake, which is totally human. And I remember that one of the other coworkers brought up, I made points for us to talk about our emotions, and one of my other coworkers brought up, I'm angry. Not because you screwed up, but I'm angry that you felt like you had to do this and you didn't share the work with the rest of the team. I'm angry that you hid all of this from us. Now, that's not the end of that conversation, but that is the start of a really good conversation. You can also look into therapy for you. I wouldn't recommend shoving the rest of your team into therapy, but therapy can be a good sort of preventive maintenance. At the very least, you can look at therapy as a chance to talk through what you're thinking with somebody that can't run away because you paid them. And that external perspective can be helpful. You also have to be careful because even good conflict can start to amp up in emotional intensity. And if you let conflict fester too long, it starts getting bad and becoming relationship conflict. If someone is antsy about feedback on their idea, maybe they're not emotionally ready to talk about it yet. I remember being a junior developer, getting feedback on a PR and being like, you can go to hell. And then go away, and you come back the next morning, and it's like, oh, yeah, they were actually right. It takes time to learn to be separate, that you are not your code. That is an emotional thing you have to learn as a developer. And so being aware that task conflict can come with that emotional valence is really important. But obviously, we don't just bring emotions to the table when we start having conflict. We bring the big whole hot mess of ourselves. Everything we are and everything we've experienced comes to the table with us. Our tendencies, whether those are innate or learned. And that means that we tend to approach conflict in certain ways. So let's talk about confrontation styles. Confrontation styles come from what's called the dual concern model. There are two axes here. The horizontal one is concerned for your outcome, how concerned you are with achieving your goals from this conflict. The vertical one is concerned for others' outcomes, how concerned you are with others achieving their goals from this conflict. That gives you 5 or 4, depending on how you count. Let's walk through them. The first we're going to talk about is avoiding. Avoiding is a strictly passive approach. You hope that problems solve themselves. And rather than discussing things or actually having conflict, you change the subject, you skip meetings, you leave the group altogether. The book club got a little too hot last time, I'm just not going to show up. There's also yielding, which is a passive, pro-social approach. Yielding solves both large and small problems by just giving in. That can either be genuine conversion, whether it's, okay, I've actually been convinced by your arguments, I give in. Or it could be superficial compliance, where you just say, I don't want to have this conflict, I don't want to damage my relationship with you, I am yielding. There's also fighting, which is the active pro-self approach. It's super concerned with its goals, its outcomes. And it uses competitive, powerful tactics to intimidate. It uses mandates, challenges, arguing, insults, accusing, complaining, even physical violence, threats of vengeance. This is model 1. And then there's cooperating, which is an active, pro-social, and pro-self approach. Cooperating identifies the issues that underlie this dispute. And it works to identify a solution for both parties that works. It attempts to get both sides to consider each other's arguments, to be in each other's shoes. This is model 2. All the research I saw, excuse me, all the research I saw said that cooperating is by far and away the most effective way of approaching conflict. There is also conciliating, which is the one that's kind of in the middle. Not all researchers actually agree that this exists. It's kind of a mixed approach where you yield some and you also try to push for some of your demands in the hopes that by yielding, the other person will then yield in response. Some people think this is just kind of swapping back and forth between yielding and fighting, or yielding and conciliating, or yielding and cooperating, rather. But I've included here for completeness sake. You need to know your go-to confrontational style. Who you are, how you have lived in the world, means that you are going to approach conflict in a particular way and approach confrontations in one of these styles as your go-to. And that can change depending on the group you're interacting with, actually. Certain groups have different norms that mandate different styles. And if you have social standing in a group, that can affect how you actually, what your default is here as well. You also need to keep an eye out for others in your group or others in your team. What are their go-to styles? Which ones are they tending to come to the table with? And what does that imply about their goals? Most importantly, when you're going through conflict with your team, you need to recognize that you and your team actually have a shared goal by default, which is that you would like to ship software that works. Unless someone on your team doesn't have that opinion, in which case, that's a whole different talk. But largely, everyone on your team wants this as a goal. Everyone on your team wants to ship things, wants to be effective, wants to deliver software. And so you can use that as a starting point for almost any argument. Well, all right, so maybe this works if you're a CEO, maybe this works if you're a CTO or whatever, but if you're just a dev, what do you do? Well, let's talk about handling conflict as an individual contributor. As a random dev, okay? And the first thing is not to sell yourself short. Don't underestimate yourself. The actions of a single individual can actually shape the norms of an entire group. The trick of this is to be firm about your point and to be constant about your point while not actually leaving the group. You want to always remain a member in good standing of that group. And what that means is you still want to follow the norms of the group, the rules of the group. You want to constantly demonstrate, I am one of you, but I have this differing opinion. Because if you leave the group, or if your behavior starts to indicate that you are different enough from the rest of the group, it's real easy for them to go, well, you're just not part of us, and ignore you. So you always want to remain a member in good standing. You always want to lead with, look, I wanted this as badly as the rest of you. I want us to be good software developers, leaning on that shared goal, right? I want us to do good work. But I think we can do that by doing this. You also need to be aware of power dynamics. Power can make you look at other people as problems to be solved. And a lack of power can change what conflicts you can actually manage. Sometimes you're not going to be able to fight every conflict if you're an individual. Power also makes other people feel like conflict threatens their social status. So in a lot of cases, what you want to do with somebody who has high social status in the group is turn around and have that conversation privately, because that will make them feel less threatened. Because if you threaten their social status, their gut is going to say, stomp that person down to maintain my control and to prove that I deserve the status that I have. And that's just built-in primate behavior. You want to try to engage with Model 2 as much as you can. Do the work to understand the other person. But this is going to require the other person to play ball. And not everybody is going to be playing ball. So you need to be aware when somebody comes back at you with Model 1. If they have power in the organization, that can make it more likely that they're going to respond with Model 1. In that moment, you have to decide if the conflict is actually worth it. Are you going to back down? Are you going to yield and say, nope, I don't care enough to actually have this fight? Or are you going to dig your heels in? And if you're going to do the latter, it helps to know the difference between goals and positions. A goal is the thing a person ultimately cares about. They're the thing that they actually want to achieve. So as an example, your CTO could want your company to appear professional and capable to all of its clients. Then there's the position. The position is how this person has envisioned getting to that goal. So your CTO could have a position that all developers should wear polos and slacks. I don't want that. You don't want that. So now you have to figure out, how do you shift these things? Because it is much easier to shift somebody's position to also achieve your goal than it is to shift their goal itself. And so you have to dig in and understand, what are their goals? And can I modify the position that they have? In the examples I was giving, you could turn around and say, look, our clients aren't going to expect us in those things. If they come around and see us in polos and slacks, they're going to think we're a stuffed shirt organization, and they're not going to think we're actually professional. They're expecting the weird quirkiness of your average boutique consultant these days. That's how things work. And helping them see the other things, and that this different position can get them their goal as well, can help you win conflicts. Or can help you both win conflicts in that Model 2 mindset. You can also find a goal that overlaps. And find a goal that just matches the position, if you have one. People with differing amounts of power in the organization often have different goals as well. They also have organizational goals, goals for the organization itself, and they have goals about their own status, like I was talking earlier about power. They want to maintain their own status. They want the organization to succeed, even though they have their own personal ones as well. This is from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I hate this book. I love this habit. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Your goal in conflict is to turn around and dig into the other person. Why do you want this? What is your goal? Why do you have this mindset? Why are you arriving at this position? Those are the things. You want to be curious. You want to dig into your collaborators' reasoning and their motivations. And then you want to turn around and say, all right, if I can't pick the kind of conflict, then I need to pick my conflicts carefully. If you dig in and you can't find an overlap in goals, you can't see a way to shift their position to overlap between both of your goals, maybe you don't have the conflict. Because again, back to the beginning, we manage conflict unconsciously, and we do it by usually squashing that conflict. In this case, what I'm saying is you can turn around and still squash the conflict because you think it's not valuable enough to rock the boat. Think about what things actually matter to you and how much power you actually have to affect those things. And this can matter a lot, especially if you are a woman developer or a person of color, because you have less organizational power, generally. And so it becomes even more important for you to understand what are the things that you can actually affect. You can also pull in other team members. You can pull in people and say, okay, all of us have talked and we all think that my way is the right way. You have to understand this could work. The other person is absolutely going to see it as a power play because it is. You are leveraging the rest of the group against them. They will feel that and they will remember it. It can work, but it's a good way to turn task conflict into relationship conflict. All right, let's bring this home. First, there's more than one type of conflict, and they aren't all bad. Task conflict is good. Process conflict early is good. Relationship conflict is bad, and process conflict later is bad. Psychological safety enables us to surface hidden conflict that's already there in our groups, in our organizations, in our teams, and helps us engage with it, to process it and move through it. Emotions are going to happen in conflict. You cannot stop them. And trying to control them using Model 1 methods is just going to create self-sealing processes. You, personally, can offer explicit moments to talk about emotions, and model talking about emotions yourself. Recognizing the confrontational style of other participants can help you adjust or withdraw from conflicts as necessary. And as an individual, you can be aware of power dynamics. You can seek overlaps in goals or positions that fulfill most or all of the goals, and you can pick your conflicts carefully. Conflict doesn't have to be this Lord of the Flies scenario, okay? It can be a thing that leads us to a place where we work better together, where we feel valued, where we create things we can be proud of. So, I want you to go forth from this talk, and I want you to conflict. Thank you very much for listening. If you have questions, I will be up here. The slides are available there. Thank you again for listening.